Frankly, I had been doing research in a rural area in Bulacan for my master's thesis at UP many, many years ago. And when I joined the Institute of Philippine Culture, where we were going to do research, it was clear that at that time, I think I had 3 children, for me to continue to do rural work was going to be difficult. Then a project emerged to do research in Tondo, on urban neighborhoods, to see how they operated in the context of the city and work. And so Father Lynch, the founder of this institute, asked me if I would like to undertake that. And that got me into the whole urban, poor people, neighborhoods, setup. It's been mostly with urban poor, but it can have the variations of children, women, adolescents. So there have been variations in it. Well, part of it stems, I think, from the fact that planners have been mainly economists, with that kind of training, quite quantitative, macro overviews, and other urban planners, administrators, who have a very kind of top-down view or their understanding of the needs of the situation of the urban poor and urbanization. I think that has, for many years, blocked the possibility of actually listening to poor people. Now, the fact that informal settlers are by definition illegal, or used to be considered illegal, meant that there was this notion that they had no rights to speak, they shouldn't be there at all in the first place, that being uneducated or less educated, that they don't know much, and that the technical people and the planners have to think for them and decide everything because they're educated. So I think that faulty understanding of knowledge, where it comes from, who has it, and who can use it most effectively, is what has distorted, the ability to understand the situation from the grassroots up. And that is the lesson, I think, that has been finally heard. There's a city summit where that notion has finally been recognized, even though it's a position that advocates for the urban poor, with the urban poor themselves, have been insisting on for decades. And that is certainly one of the messages they have been pushing for decades, that the poor people have rights. And because of the assumption that out-of-town relocation or go back to the province, even though many of them are urban-born and don't really have provinces anymore, that they know the solutions, when in reality, poor people have managed to cope in one way or another and develop themselves to have a better life in the city. So the whole notion of listen to people is, comes from the gradual recognition that they have a very good understanding of their situation, that they even have, when they get organized and begin to think through where they're going and develop people's plans, that actually these make a lot of sense. And government has begun to see that if you connect with those and then bring in what government and technology and public administration can do to support their efforts, is really the win-win situation. Well, the very recent recognition that the best way of dealing with urban poor, which are 1/3 or more of the city, urban poor informal settlers, is on-site upgrading where they already are, because then you don't have to worry about employment. I mean, they already have some access to some form of employment, even though, of course, that can be improved, right? They already know where the hospitals and the centers are. There's a barangay that's organized, and so on. So on-site upgrading, if at all possible, is the best way to go. Right? And informal settlers have shown that they're willing to move back from the estero and even go up a little in order to accommodate everybody, and there's a lot of evidence for that. The other one is on-site, near-site, that is within the city, nearby if possible, so that they can continue the lifestyle, not lifestyle, the ways they have been able to cope with city life. Right? So that's with the least displacement. And that's why nearby, if they have to move away from real danger zones, that nearby adjacent communities are really the best. And government doesn't have to invest huge amounts of money, as they're doing in their location sites, to create whole new settlements, which in many cases do not respond to their needs. So if that is the orientation, which now seems to be the case because the City Summit is showing that, highlighting that, if that's part of the 20-year sequence, that will be really a very good sign. I mean, we have to find land and places in the city for the urban poor. It's an inclusive urbanization. Okay, well, first let me do the solid management, waste management, right? The assumption is that you have to address that problem in the context of informal settlements. You hope if that's an upgrading, on-site upgrading, then it's really organized communities that can tackle that. We have seen that in over the past many years. When communities organize, and usually NGOs initially help them to get organized, to see, to sort out what are their priorities, what are their sense of problem, issues, how can they address it, first small issues, just getting a water tap in or etc. And over time that they learn how to manage their own communities. And once you have that ongoing, then to bring in, how do you manage this waste? Because they themselves, they don't like dog droppings all over the place. They don't like mud here and there. They don't like that water is in tubes running through the community which go underwater sometimes. They know that that's going to be polluted, etc. But until they get organized and decide how they're going to address this as a community, and therefore a certain solidarity that people will collaborate with whoever is leading this effort from inside, then you can really manage it. And we have evidence of that among several of the communities that have gotten organized. And one of the early issues they address is waste management. Well, I think that's certainly a very important thing. I think that we should, while it's a highly technical issue, we always have to remember that the technical and the social, cultural, and economic, environmental are all really one package. So while rehabilitation may be the immediate aim, you have to say, what will be the impact of whatever the new changes, in other words, tell me what will be the immediate effect of rehabilitating the pumping stations. In other words, it's a kind of a total technical package, which is fine, but I think you have to see, all right, what is the impact, let's say, of the communities if they're still on the way, especially the poor communities, if they're on the esteros. Like the Mangahan floodway, for example. They are affected by, the floodway is really an artificial river in the sense that it's part of the pumping decisions. But over the years, that informal settlement community has already worked out arrangements with the pumping station leaders or, implementors, that if they're going to change the direction of the flow or the level of the flow, they inform the people, and there's like a siren or a whistle or something, so they know it's going to happen, and then they can get organized accordingly. See, so those are some of the things. You have to know the changes that take place in the course of the river. How will it affect the people who are living in the river? Not just informal settlers, of course, but, all the middle and even upper income communities. So that larger picture has to be understood in the context of changing or improving the pumping stations. Seen really from the point of the people either along the waterways or in the city, whether they're poor or rich, it's how is it going to affect them? They really have to know. They have to discuss with the communities, tell them this is what might happen, that's what might happen. There has to be consultation with people who are affected, and so they have to determine that. And I think that would be, my message to NEDA. As you do this technology, recognize and get the views or inform and discuss with those communities who may be affected by it. not only mainly so that they can collaborate in effective action to enable that whole process to work. All right. Let's say, and then there's this other thing. I think the recent efforts of, say, I think Quezon City, a couple of the governments, to stop using plastic bags. So environmental issues like that, if people don't have plastic bags, they're not going to throw them in the river. If there's good garbage collection, they're not going to throw them in there. They're more likely to use the right garbage collection if the trucks can actually remove their garbage. But many times the trucks can't get into the settlement, so it just grows and grows, and nobody feels they can take action unless they're organized. The reason that I think that government needs to partner is that people have their own knowledge, and there's a tremendous variety in living arrangements in the population, especially the poor population. They're not just one homogeneous group. I mean, they may be poor, but there are levels of poverty. Women are more poorer than some men, or children more disadvantaged, etc. So there's a lot of variation even within poor populations. Yeah, because of the level of local knowledge, or you call it indigenous knowledge. People know. Let's take with flood management. The assumption, at least some years ago, especially immediately after Ondoy, is government has to resettle everybody. Get them out, because they don't understand or because it's dangerous. No consultation with the people at the time. When people, they say, we have been flooded ever since we moved here 50 years ago. There have been floods on this river, and we know how to deal with it. As soon as the rain pattern begins to change, or when the water comes to 2 inches above the bottom step of my house, I know, hey, that's when we start packing the kids up, or that's when we start moving the packages of bundles of clothing up to the ceiling, with a pulley system. And so they have a system of gradually figuring out, as they assess what's the danger, okay, what's the next level of action they have to take. Ultimately, it's take the children and women. Women go to the evacuation centers, the school, or to their kamag-anak who live near, who have a third story, and then they call the men, come back from work, they text them because it's already over 2 inches, the men rush home, so there's a lot of evidence that people have dealt with flood risks for years. What we have now realized, however, and they themselves have realized, that a flood like the Ondoy flood was something they had never experienced. It was very widespread. And so then often these traumatic events are what enable people to make a mind shift and say, maybe we have to do things a bit differently now. And they become more open to different possibilities that are offered to them. But these have to be discussed with them. Not just, the solution is you have to go to out-of-town relocation sites. And when, as their famous mantra is, you moved us, the ones who are in relocation sites, from danger zones, which you call danger zones, to death zones for us, because we cannot survive there. I'm thinking mostly of the Mangahan floodway, because I just read a thesis of one of my grad students who worked with the community, whom I also know very well, in Mangahan floodway. And one of the things she points out, and they say themselves, is, sanay naman kami sa baha. Di ba, noong pa yun. So, but they acknowledge that, but Ondoy was really different, ganon. So it made them rethink. But at the same time, they said, alam mo, minsan, we're happy when pagbaha, reasonable, because yung mga isda, there's a overflow from Laguna de Bay, or the river, or the fish traps, which are nearby them. So the fish all come into their communities, and all they do is just collect them, and they have tremendous fish catch because it's public property now. Yeah. So for them, it's a windfall, as long as it's a limited flooding, which they're used to. So, they have their own understandings based on their own evidence or experience over years of how to deal with it. So the point is, listen to them first before taking up deciding what's the solution. I mean, how many years have we, since Sapang Palay, which was the 1960s, the first that I remember relocation to Bulacan, already then, where's the employment? Where's the transport back to the city? I mean, misery, so many people, of course, come back. We have known that for the last, how many is that now, 50, 60 years? And yet, still building relocation areas outside which are not prepared for the people whom they move in. And what Ondoy did was, especially because the technical people managed to get the president to issue an executive order of relocation, because of the danger, misunderstanding the much larger situation, and the allocation of funds, which the urban poor fought for, which the president allocated 50 billion for on-site upgrading and nearby, solving the problems on this area without having to relocate. But because the government system, it's not such NHA as such, being recalcitrant, the government systems of public finance administration are not set up to respond to different kinds of community proposals, needs. They're not, only recently do they have an urban outreach, etc. See, so anyway, that whole thing has to be fixed. The best is, I have found, if the implementors especially, but eventually the planners of a government entity, really talk to people in their own communities. And I have evidence of that because we helped the DPWH have what they call a capacity building program for their engineers. Earlier this year, they got the support of ADB because their engineers found they're constantly fighting urban poor settlers, who throw things at them, who fight with them. And so Secretary Singson, who I think is a very open and understanding person, and his higher level staff, said, there was this flood forum at the ADB a couple of 3-4 years ago where these issues were raised, and they asked me to help with the NGO PO sector. So I brought in NGOs and community groups to talk there, at ADB. And so about their experiences. And so the DPWH, Singson was there and others, said, maybe we should pursue that. All right, so, there came this what I call project, in which a team which I led was asked to help build the capacities of engineers in DPWH to deal with informal settlers. Okay, how did we do that? Well, we had 2 workshops, 40 each engineers, and first we did a needs assessment. What did they think of, what's their experience with informal settlers? The ones from outside Manila didn't have much, but the Manila ones had a lot of reasonable experience. Many of them, a high proportion, had unpleasant experiences. Some had more positive experiences. By the way, it seemed that the women engineers, of whom there are not many, seem to have more positive experiences than the males. I don't want to generalize at all, but women, I guess, are more oriented to people and communities, and so they listed their responses as quite somewhat positive. Anyway, so we were faced with here are engineers who are suspicious of them, who basically don't like dealing with them, etc. So we set up a 3-day workshop. The first is to begin to get them to understand what's the context of urban slum living, or urban poor people, and why they're there. But what I've learned over the many years of teaching is, I can say it, but if you put them in direct contact with those who are affected, it's much more effective. In other words, especially if they're organized. So the second day, we have these community exposure where we sent 10 by 10 to 4 sites on the riverways. And we knew the communities because I've worked with the NGOs, worked with them. And I said, are you prepared? Can you tell them about your lives? Because we're trying to get them to understand your perspectives. At first they said, are you equivalently, DPWH, yung mga engineers na yun, they're the problem. And I said, that's exactly why we want them to you talk to them and explain why you are there, why you don't want to move to the distant. All right. So they went, and we said, you're there to listen. You're not to solve anything, whatever. You're there just to listen. And of course, the NGOs, who are the support groups, and the POs, we had already briefed them ahead of time. You have to tell them in a somewhat organized way your stories, right? Okay. So the third day, the last day, they came back, and they were just aghast at, parang tao rin pala sila, you know, may pamilya din sila. They just want their children to go to school, and they're so afraid if they go to the resettlement area, they won't get the right education, plus they don't have a job, plus how are they going to manage? All their social networks are ruptured because they're now transferred, etc. So the engineers were just so, really overwhelmed with the problems that the people face. So they were, for the first time, I think, they were seeing it through the lens of the people, the eyes of the people themselves. And they said, tama naman sila. Siguro kung ako yon, I would do the same. You know, and that empathy is something I think you cannot train from outside. It's a value change that comes because tao rin pala sila. You know? I mean, it's a very patronizing statement, but you know where they're coming from, that it shifted paradigm change. That's what I'm saying. So that, I mean, there are many ways, but this to me is one very important way of changing people's perceptions of groups whom they look down on, whom they discriminate against, whom they think are illegal, whom they think have no rights. Just talk to them, listen to them, and you rely on they themselves begin to change. They won't all have the same reactions, but by and large, we find if they listen to people, especially if they're organized and know how to present their issues, it makes a huge difference. Let's say partly, you know, these issues have already been raised in the cities as we prepare this whole city summit process. As the urban poor themselves, who are now, you know, part of the process happily, you know, they're saying, first stop the evictions and relocations. If the government is serious about changing the paradigm and really being responsive to people's needs, to show its sincerity and to reduce the suffering of those who are, again, not forced, but, you know, relocate, stop the relocate, have a moratorium. And in fact, there is, I think the government who's running this has sent a request, I guess, a letter to the president's office to ask him to stop the moratorium so that the process can continue in a trust relationship. And trust is very important. You know, in development literature, you'll see it all the time. How do you build trust between those who are implementing programs and those who are being affected by them? And you build it by constant interaction, arguing, of course, you know, it's not that everybody, but genuine consultation, which is interaction, you know, and trying to find solutions, not just talking and talking, but people say, at least, you know, we cannot, this proclamation, presidential proclamation, we've had this for 20 years, but the implementing rules and regulations have never been passed, so it's nothing changed. So can we work on that? Yung ganon, huh? So I think that's the first thing is, well, and the question of moratorium, I think, is very important if you want these organized community groups to participate in this process. That's one. The second is really identify what have been the bottlenecks and constraints over the years, no? Between government, who has money for all kinds of variations on social housing, which has housing finance, and yet they can't, the poor who should have access somehow can't access. Why? You have to look at very specific cases. So now, in fact, we're the community groups are mobilizing and NGOs are helping to document that whole process. Where did they, you know, not go wrong, but where were the bottlenecks? For example, I know with the Estero de San Miguel, or many of them, all right, they have a plan and they meet with the government interagency, which is, however, you know, so many interagencies that, and there's no single one. NHA is for housing and relocation, but housing finance is in other government and so on. And then there's the local government, which is another whole. And so people are always going here. They don't know, where do they go? This is supposed to give you permission. That's supposed. And so they're always stuck with a system which was not created to respond to flexibly to community-based initiatives. It was created for a formal economy, with corporations and government organizations, but not small-scale, thousands of small-scale entities, right? So there has to be a way also of figuring out how to deal with all of these entities, because they can't deal with everyone, but we have barangays, so barangays in the local government really have to be the base for significant change. And the trouble with Metro Manila is because the national agencies are all here and are developing many of these programs, which are supposed to be nationwide, but in reality, it's the biggest problem is Manila, that the local governments are kind of, operating in kind of a different mainstream. In the provinces, we've seen Cebu, Davao, the local governments have much more control and they can make decisions. And because they're accountable to their electorate, whom they're very aware of, they kind of listen, sort of. But in Manila, it's so huge and the local governments are not really used to, with such huge populations, even barangay level, genuine consultations. And then there's the national agency who is also pulling the strings. So Manila is really a confusing, difficult thing. So what we're saying is, start by looking at the actual, ongoing, live cases, as they call it, and see where the difficulties rose, and see then, and government has to look at them, and the NGOs and POs, academics, to look at the whole thing and say, okay, how systemically can we deal with this in terms of housing finance rules, in terms of land use rules, etc. I think we should get away from that literally trickle down, it's because trickle down implies all of this is done and then little by little it gets to people, which I understand the image, but the paradigm change now is from the beginning. Even when you're conceptualizing the issue, you should already be discussing it. Otherwise, you always get the current situation where government plans, whether it's a railroad, a road, a highway, and then they go to implement and they say, we will discuss with the people, but the plan is already there, And so people say, well, we have no say anymore, because we're supposed to move or we're supposed to do this. So government planning processes have to include already from the beginning consultations with the affected persons, so that together they can work out at the beginning how it should work. Otherwise, what you have is, as one engineer told me, our program, it was an infrastructure project. He said, we have certain time, this was a dam. He said, by this month, this has to be done. We have tons of this cement and this and that. So, and then immediately, so the plan of the technology is laid out. So he said, the train is going. Meanwhile, we're consulting with the communities and the train is going and they're still discussing and, and so that's it. There's no meshing. And that's because they only come to the people once the plan is decided. If you do it from the beginning, it's difficult, but because there's so many stakeholders. But in the end, it will save time. How many of our projects are delayed years, right? The North Rail, years of literally derailment, because they didn't consult the people. They just In dealing, especially with informal settlements, one of the things that surprises, I think, outsiders, is how articulate the women are. In almost every slum community, and this is not only in the Philippines, but worldwide, Latin America, Africa, when it comes to settlements of poor people, it's really the women who begin to take positions. And that's logical because they're there. They're mostly there all the time. The husbands are working or looking for work somewhere. They're not, culturally, they're not expected to be staying in the community, even though some of them actually work as welders, carpenters. But basically, the women are there, and they're the ones who have to face the child who is not fed, who's hungry, right? And so their sense of urgency as a group, as a gender, is, I would say, much greater than the men. This is not to say that the men don't care. No, no, no. It's that the women have to face that problem every single day. Yung pagkain ng mga anak ko, you know. And if you don't eat, wala kami dapat tatlong beses ang araw, at least to eat. If not, then you're poor. That's their definition of poverty, right? If you can't eat 3 times a day regularly, then you're really poor because you can't even manage the most basic need of your family. So that's why it's very fascinating that when you look at people's organizations, it's really the women who learn to, and NGOs have found that, who learn to articulate, who really stick to it, you know, because they have the highest level of concern. And they know when to bring in the men. When there's a flood, you know, then they call the men in and so on. So they can manage how, it's not a question of feminist anything, right? Although it is feminist, but it's not a question of we're better than they. They mix it, no? They know how to deal with the men, but they have a sense of their capacity, especially once they're organized. And that is what technical people often don't understand because most of them are men, especially engineers. So they're not used to dealing with women as leaders. But the ones that we exposed to the community were quite admiring. And the men were there too. The women brought in the men because they don't want, you know, they want to show this is where the men fit in. No? So this dynamics of communities and how resilient they are and how they manage to, over years, to have ties that enable them to survive despite tremendous pressures from government, you know, not to survive, it seems, is really something that it gives you pride. You know, in Filipinos, I think in poor people everywhere around the world who show their capacities. And that's why I've been even in social scientists now, and we do that kind of interviewing. Well, you can do surveys, you know, but we know surveys up to a point are useful. But basically, if you want to understand the situation, you just have to sit there, make cuento. It's really cuentos. And then you derive from the cuentos, what are the patterns, you know, who is saying what and why? And that's where we begin to get the really, I think, important and useful data. And people know, that's what you're pointing out. People know their situation. And, you know, this, in sociology, they say agency. People have a sense of agency. They can do things. You know, they do a lot of things, mainly to urban poor communities, mainly because I connect with NGOs and POs. And they invite me to come, you know, if they need some help in conceptualizing the issues. And so that's kind of the role I play. And sometimes we do, here in this institute, we do quite a lot of research in urban poor communities. You know, apropos that, I hope that there is provision for a systematic, easy way of some of those funds going to community groups or coalitions of community groups according to their agreement. Anyway, that it's available maybe through NGOs or some mechanism where they can get access to funds for them to organize. You know, let's take the city summit. They have been very active, you know, and very interested in putting their voices in. But now they're beginning to say, after the 3rd meeting in Congress or in the Senate, may pera for travel, because they're coming from all over. And they have to spend their own money, you know, and sometimes the NGO can provide it. But if you want people to plan, just as if you want government planners to plan, you have to fund them, right? But there's this notion that, no, we can't fund them, you know. Of course you have to fund them. The trouble is, they don't really like funding from government so far, largely because, especially if it's local government, where it's very political often, they feel they have to respond in certain ways. They don't have autonomy. So there has to be a mechanism where they have access to funds for organizing, for doing their own research, which is what they're being asked to do now, put together all this information. You know, that means that they need people who are, you know, they're barbers and hairdressers and waiters and waitresses and security guards. Are they going to take off from their earning in order to do this? Well, somehow they have to, it can't be volunteer all the way. They have to be compensated in some way. Otherwise, how are they going to survive? So there's this notion, well, anyway, so that there's, I mean, in some of the development literature, they're now talking, well, I just said open development, but that's networks. But something like affirmative planning or something like, I don't know, there's a term for it now, development, affirmative development, or anyway, where all of these fund flows for the purposes of like flood management improvement, that some of them have to be allocated in such a way that people have access. And there are lots of examples now. Usually send up NGO networks or NGO networks, which are legitimate, they're registered with the Securities and Exchange, and can access and are accountable and are evaluated, so they can allocate money. And those work. They have in Thailand, I think I've seen it in South Africa, in Zambia, and we have cases also here, but that has to be more systematic. People have access to funds themselves. It can be that, but I think it's more yung mga anak ko. I mean, why do they do everything they can to send their kids to school? Hindi lang high school para makatapos sila. And makatapos means college, because they know, unless you have a college education, you are not able to compete as much for higher income in the formal sector with benefits, as if you have, quote, only high school, or certainly only lower, elementary. So we know that is a very strong drive. So what that indicates is, in my own life, it's hard, I'm here already, depends on how old or how young they are, but at least yung mga anak ko, they should not, you certainly see that among the informal settlers, yung sa payatas, we have a lot of information where the parents say, so that their lives will not be like mine. And even the kids, we have quotes from the kids saying, sana makapag-aral naman ako para matapos ako, para yung buhay ko ay hindi katulad ng buhay ng mga magulang ko. So they're very aware. But I think they see it as a long-term strategy, because mostly they don't see short-term ways in which they will get out of poverty quickly. So it's unti-unti, even though from one point of analysis, there are those who are critical of it because they say it breaks up families, and that's all true. But they are willing, especially if they're single. If they're single, where the family is, not having a husband, wife, children is not so much at stake, that's their solution, and it's that lower middle class solution. The poorest are not the ones who get to go, but, the poor but somewhat may kaya naman.